World.
Basically, ultimately, world, ultimately, world, ultimately, market, ultimately, world, market, world, market, world, ultimately,
world,
ultimately, world, market, ultimately, in legislation, market, ultimately, world, market, ultimately,
world,
market, ultimately,
largest world,
ultimately, market, ultimately,
world,
ultimately, the world, ultimately, the world.